Welcome to the channel, everyone. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you for listening. I never thought spring in Maine could be so unforgiving. The sun was out, but the breeze coming off the Atlantic had a bite to it, carrying the dampness of melting snow. The dense woods of Acadia National Park surrounded me, with bare trees starting to bud and patches of green pushing through the thawing ground. It should have felt like renewal, but something about that day left me uneasy. My name's Robert Reeves. I'm a park ranger, originally from Detroit. Life there taught me how to handle tough situations, grit, instinct, and knowing when to move fast or keep my head down. My dog, Rusty, a scrappy mutt with a nose for trouble, came with me when I took the job with Maine. Rusty was my shadow, always alert and eager, his wiry coat blending into the wilderness better than I ever could. That day, I was tasked with checking an abandoned fire lookout tower deep in the park. The spring thaw often made trails hazardous, and hikers occasionally got stranded or lost. The tower was a known trouble spot for anyone foolhardy enough to think they could handle the park's remoteness without a map or sense of direction. A group of college kids had reported hearing strange noises the night before, but none of them had stayed long enough to investigate. I didn't think much of it, probably a fox or a raccoon scuffing through the underbrush. Still, protocol demanded I check it out, so Rusty and I set out on foot. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Every now and then, Rusty would stop, his ears pricking up, but I chalked it up to squirrels or birds. By the time we reached the lookout, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The tower stood tall, its wooden frame weathered but sturdy. I climbed the steps, Rusty at my heels, and surveyed the surrounding forest. Nothing unusual, just a sea of bare branches swaying in the wind. Then I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, too large to be a deer and too upright to be a bear. It moved between the trees, slow and deliberate, as if it knew I was watching. My breath caught in my throat as Rusty growled, low and deep, his hackles raised. "Easy boy," I whispered, gripping the handle of my flashlight like a weapon. The figure paused, and for a moment I thought I imagined it. Then it stepped into a patch of fading light, and my blood turned cold. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, with a gaunt, almost skeletal frame covered in patchy fur. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and animal features, with elongated jaws and sharp, glinting teeth. Its eyes were the worst part, burning yellow, intelligent, and filled with something far worse than hunger. It didn't charge, it didn't roar, it just stared, its head cocking slightly, as if it were sizing me up. I've heard the camping stories, the whispers about creatures that roam these woods, wendigos, skinwalkers, dogmen. I always thought they were just that, stories, but standing there, staring at this thing, I knew those tales had a kernel of truth. "Rusty, let's go," I said, my voice barely steady. We backed down the steps, the creature still watching us, its breath visible in the cold air. Once we hit the ground, I turned and ran, Rusty barking at my heels. The thing let out a guttural snarl, deep, wet, and full of malice. That sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't look back. The trail back to the ranger station felt endless, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves setting my nerves on edge. I knew better than to make noise or shine my flashlight. It would only give away my position. Rusty stayed close, his normally wagging tail tucked between his legs. Halfway back, I heard it again, the crunch of snow and leaves behind us, deliberate and heavy. It was following us, keeping pace just out of sight. I stopped and crouched low, gripping my knife in one hand and Rusty's collar in the other. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might give me away. Then without warning, it lunged. The creature burst from the trees, its claws slashing through the air. I threw myself to the side, dragging Rusty with me, as its talons raked the spot where I'd just been. It moved faster than anything that size should, its snarls echoing through the woods. I slashed at it with my knife, the blade catching its arm and drawing a dark, viscous blood that smelled like rotting meat. The creature howled, a bone-chilling sound that made my ears ring. Rusty barked and snapped at its legs, giving me enough time to scramble to my feet. We ran. The ranger station was still a good mile away, and I wasn't sure we'd make it. The creature was relentless, crashing through the underbrush, its glowing eyes never losing sight of us. I remembered something. One of the older rangers had told me. A trick for evading predators. Change direction, he'd said. Don't run in a straight line. It will confuse them. I veered left, then right, weaving through the trees. Rusty followed, his instincts sharp as ever. The creature faltered for a moment, its momentum carrying it past us, and I used the chance to put some distance between us. When we finally burst into the clearing near the station, I saw the lights from the porch. Relief flooded me, but I didn't stop until we were inside. The door bolted shut behind us. The creature didn't follow. It stayed at the edge of the tree line, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It let out one last, mournful howl before disappearing into the darkness. I called for backup, but by the time the other rangers arrived, there was no trace of it. Just the blood on my knife and the deep gashes in the trees where it had attacked. They believed me though. In these woods, you don't ignore stories like that. Welcome to the channel, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Please let me know if you like the stories. Some of them are pretty good, I think. Yeah, enjoy the rest of the stories. I've always loved autumn in the Pacific Northwest. The fiery reds, oranges, and the yellows painted across the towering evergreens. The crispness in the air and the ever-present fog that clings to the ground like an old haunting memory. But working as a ranger in a place as vast as wild as Olympic National Park, I've learned to respect the forest's secrets. Out here, the beauty hides a sharp edge. My name is Brian Russell. I grew up in Seattle, surrounded by coffee shops and bustling markets, with the smell of salt water from Puget Sound always in the air. I used to cook at a small diner in the city, but something about the concrete and crowds started to suffocate me. The park offered something different: space, silence, and a chance to feel small against nature's immensity. That week, we were tasked with locating a group of hikers who had been reported missing. 2 days overdue. Their car still parked at the trailhead. It wasn't uncommon for people to underestimate the wilderness, especially as the weather turned colder. Snow was forecasted that night, and we needed to find them fast. There were 4 of us: me, Sarah, our field medic, Dean, our survival expert, and Marcus, our communications lead. We set out at dawn, packs loaded with supplies, and followed the trail until it disappeared beneath layers of damp leaves. The forest felt heavier than usual, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you question every sound. By late afternoon, the sky was already turning grey, and the wind carried the sharp scent of rain. We stumbled upon a campsite, a fire pit, cold and abandoned, gear scattered, as if the hikers had left in a hurry. "Tracks head this way," Dean said, pointing to a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. His voice was steady, but I caught the tension in his jaw. As we followed the trail, the snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, coating the ground in a thin white blanket. It muted everything, even the crunch of our boots. Sarah broke the silence. "Brian, didn't you read something about this area recently? Some magazine article?" I nodded, remembering the piece I'd skimmed a few weeks ago. It was about the local folklore tales of strange creatures sighted in the park. Most of it was the usual Bigfoot nonsense, but the section stuck with me. Stories of hikers vanishing without a trace. Their campsites left undisturbed except for claw marks on the trees. The article dismissed it as a bear attack, but the descriptions were eerily precise. I didn't tell them that part. "Weird stories about bears," I said instead, trying to keep it light. "You know how these legends get started." Sarah didn't look convinced. The first sign of trouble came just after dusk. We found a torn jacket snagged on a branch, the fabric stiff with blood. Rust streaked the ground, leading further into the dark. "Stay close," Marcus said, his hand on the radio strapped to his chest. This could still be a rescue. But the forest was different now. Colder, quieter, the trees seeming to close in around us. We set up a small fire in a clearing, hoping the light would guide the hikers back if they were nearby. The snow fell heavier, hissing as it melted on the flames. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by the crunch of snow under heavy footsteps. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Bear?" Sarah whispered, though her tone said she didn't believe it. Dean shook his head. "Too heavy, and bears don't talk like that." The growl came again, closer this time, and then a flash of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I caught a glimpse of it. Tall, hunched, with long limbs that ended in claws. Its face was obscured by the dark, but its eyes, yellow and glowing, pierced through the shadows. "What the hell is that?" Marcus said, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the creature lunged. It moved impossibly fast, slamming into Dean and dragging him into the trees. His scream cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. "Dean!" Sarah shouted, grabbing a flare from her pack and igniting it. The red glow cast eerie shadows across the clearing, but the creature was gone. "We need to move," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "Now!" We didn't bother putting out the fire. Grabbing our gear, we ran, the snow whipping around us. The forest seemed alive with sound, branches snapping, footsteps circling us, guttural snarls that sent shivers down my spine. The creature was toying with us, letting us know it was still there. "We have to get to the road," Marcus said. "It's a straight shot east from here." But the creature wasn't done. It appeared again, blocking our path, its massive form silhouetted against the snow. I could see it clearly now, its matted fur, the elongated snout, and those eyes filled with an intelligence that made it more terrifying than any animal. Marcus fired the flare directly at it, the bright light making it recoil. "Go!" he shouted, shoving us forward. We ran, adrenaline overriding the cold and exhaustion. The creature pursued, its howls echoing through the forest. At one point, it swiped at me, claws tearing through my jacket and grazing my arm. I stumbled, but kept moving, Sarah pulling me up. When we finally broke through the tree line, the lights of a small town flickered in the distance. The creature stopped, pacing at the edge of the woods, its eyes never leaving us. It let out a long, mournful howl before retreating into the shadows. We didn't stop until we reached the town, collapsing in a gas station parking lot. Dean was gone. The locals didn't ask many questions, they just nodded grimly when we told them where we'd come from. One older man muttered something about the rougarou, but I didn't ask him to elaborate. We never found Dean, and the park service didn't push for answers. Some things, I've learned, are better left in the dark. The Appalachian forests have a way of swallowing you whole. Towering trees with gnarled branches block out the sunlight even in autumn, when the leaves bleed fiery reds and oranges. It's beautiful and unsettling, like the woods are alive, watching. My name is Chris Johnson, and I've worked as a ranger here for 4 years. I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, a place of endless skies and sprawling plains, the kind of landscape where you always know what's coming. My childhood was filled with games of Warhammer 40k, where battles raged across tabletops in a universe far darker than the one I thought I lived in. Back then, the idea of danger was plastic figures and dice rolls, nothing like what I've seen in these woods. We'd been assigned the task to locate a missing backpacker. Her name was Emily Winters, a 27-year-old who had set out on a solo hike and hadn't returned. Her car was still parked at the trailhead, untouched for 3 days. With the first hints of snow dusting the higher elevations, we couldn't afford to wait. There were 4 of us: me, David, our team lead with decades of experience, Laura, a sharp-witted survivalist, and Nate, a quiet but reliable medic. We packed light but prepared for a few days in the wild. The forest was dense and tangled, the trails narrow and winding. It was easy to see how someone could get turned around out here. The first day passed uneventfully, though an unsettling quiet hung over the woods. Birds and squirrels were scarce, and the usual rustle of leaves felt muted. By nightfall, we set up camp near a small stream. A fire crackled in the clearing, and the smell of burning pine filled the air. I sat staring at the flames, thinking about an article I'd read in one of those yellow newspapers you find in gas stations and diners. It talked about strange sightings in this area, tall figures moving between the trees, guttural howls in the dead of night. The writer claimed it was a dogman, a werewolf-like creature rooted in local lore. I dismissed it as a campfire story meant to spook tourists, but now, in the heart of the forest, the memory made my skin crawl. "Urge to Chris," Laura said, tossing a pine cone at me. "You good?" "Yeah," I lied, forcing a grin. "Just thinking about how Kansas winters don't prepare you for this." David chuckled. "These woods have their own kind of cold." The second day, we found signs of Emily. A scarf snagged on a branch, her water bottle lying in the dirt. But the tracks leading away were strange. They started as human footprints, then shifted into something else. "Bear?" Nate suggested, though his tone was uncertain. David crouched down, his flashlight illuminating the prints. "Maybe," he said, but his furrowed brow told a different story. That night, the snow began to fall in earnest, a soft, relentless curtain that muffled every sound. We camped again, the fire burning low, and huddled in our sleeping bags. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. A low guttural growl, so deep it vibrated in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Nate, who was keeping watch. He nodded, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of snow under heavy footsteps. I unzipped my bag, heart pounding, and reached for the hatchet strapped to my pack. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows into the trees. Then I saw it, a flash of movement, a hulking figure that seemed to blur at the edges, like it wasn't entirely there. "Wake them up," I hissed, and Nate shook David and Laura awake. The thing circled our camp, just out of reach of the firelight. When it finally stepped closer, I froze. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with limbs too long for its body, and a face that was almost human, but horribly wrong. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its breath came out in visible puffs, steaming in the cold air. "Move!" David barked, grabbing his knife. We didn't bother putting out the fire. We ran, adrenaline drowning out the cold as we stumbled through the snow. The creature followed, its howls echoing through the forest. It toyed with us, letting us think we were gaining ground before cutting us off again. At one point, Laura tripped, and the creature lunged. I swung my hatchet, catching it in the shoulder. It let out a screech that sounded more like a dozen voices layered on top of each other, and it retreated, giving us precious seconds to pull Laura to her feet. We finally reached the trailhead as dawn broke, the dim light revealing the creature standing at the forest's edge. It didn't cross the line, it just stared at us with glowing eyes before turning and disappearing into the trees. We piled into the truck and didn't look back. Later, as we reported the incident, I couldn't help but think of the article again. The dogman, the local legends. Whatever it wasn't a story anymore. Winter in Montana's Glacier National Park was a beast of its own, with endless stretches of snow-laden wilderness framed by jagged peaks and frozen lakes. The air was sharp enough to sting your lungs with each breath, and the wind carried an eerie howl that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I'd worked as a ranger here for 2 years and thought I'd seen my fair share of harsh conditions. Something about this assignment already felt off. My name's Gary Evans. I came to Montana from Boston, a place defined by its gritty streets, Red Sox loyalty, and love for clam chowder that bordered on religion. I was a city guy growing up, spending my free time devouring movies at local theaters. Out here, the isolation was a stark contrast, but the job gave me purpose, and Glacier's rugged beauty was something Boston could never offer. Our task this time was grim. A snowstorm had rolled through a few days ago, and a pair of hikers were overdue to check in. They'd been exploring trails near Avalanche Creek, an area notorious for its dense woods and unpredictable weather. It wasn't uncommon for people to lose their way in conditions like these. Still, the missing hikers hadn't been seen or heard from in over 48 hours, and with temperatures plunging below zero that night, time wasn't on their side. The team consisted of me, Jackson, a seasoned ranger whose gruff demeanor masked a heart of gold, Elena, a sharp and resourceful tracker, and Tommy, a green recruit with a knack for staying calm under pressure. We packed snowshoes, radios, emergency kits, and enough supplies for 3 days in case the search dragged on. The hike to Avalanche Creek was silent except for the crunch of snow underfoot. The wind clawed through the trees, which swayed like specters in the dim light of the sun that never quite broke through the clouds. Jackson led the way, his flashlight cutting through the growing gloom. "Keep your eyes peeled for tracks," Elena said, her voice muffled by her scarf. "If they wandered off the main trail, we'll need every clue we can get." As night fell, we set up camp in a clearing shielded by towering pines. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the snow. The cold was biting, but the heat of the flames offered some reprieve. "Ever heard of the stories about this place?" Jackson asked, poking the fire with a stick. "What stories?" Tommy asked, trying to sound casual but failing to mask his unease. "They say strange things roam these woods," Jackson replied. "Bigfoot, skinwalkers, wendigos, pick your poison. Hunters and trappers talk about things that shouldn't exist, always chalked it up to cabin fever." I didn't join the conversation, but the stories weren't new to me. Rangers shared them like campfire tales, especially during winter shifts when the isolation messed with your head. I'd always dismissed them as a folklore until that night. It started around midnight. I was keeping watch while the others slept, the fire burning low. The wind had picked up, carrying a sound with it, a deep, resonant moan that didn't belong to the wind or any animal I knew. It echoed through the trees, lingering like the ghost of a scream. I shook Jackson awake. "Hear that?" He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and listened. The sound came again, louder this time. It was closer. "Could be an injured animal," Jackson said, though his tone uncertain. He grabbed his rifle, motioning for me to follow. Elena and Tommy stirred, their faces pale as they listened to the noise grow. We decided to stick together, leaving the campfire burning as we ventured toward the sound. The forest seemed alive, each creak of a branch and crunch of snow amplified in the freezing air. The tracks appeared out of nowhere, deep impressions in the snow, larger than any bear's. The shape was all wrong, the toes elongated and clawed. My stomach churned. "What the hell made these?" Elena whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. Before anyone could answer, the sound erupted again, this time from directly ahead. A figure loomed in the shadows, tall and hunched, its form distorted by the flickering beam of Jackson's flashlight. It moved with unnatural speed, vanished before we could get a clear look. "Back to camp," Jackson barked. We stumbled through the snow, adrenaline surging. When we reached the clearing, the fire was out. The creature had been here. Deep gouges marred the trees, and our supplies were scattered. A trail of blood led away from the camp. Tommy was missing. "Tommy!" Elena screamed. The wind howled, drawing out her cries. The creature's moan answered, sending chills down my spine. It was toying with us. We didn't have a choice. We had to find Tommy before the storm worsened. Following the blood trail, we ventured deeper into the woods, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. Then we saw it, a hulking silhouette crouched in the snow, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Tommy lay limp in its claws, blood staining the snow around him. The creature's head snapped towards us, and it let out a guttural roar that froze me in place. "Run!" Jackson shouted, firing his rifle. The shot hit its mark, but the creature barely flinched, dropping Tommy and charging us. We scattered, crashing through the trees. I tripped, landing face first in the snow. When I looked up, the creature was looming over me. Its breath was hot and foul, steam rising from its maw. Before it could strike, Jackson appeared, swinging a flaming branch. The creature recoiled, retreating into the shadows. With an ear-splitting shriek, we grabbed Tommy, who was barely breathing, and made our way back toward the trailhead. We didn't stop until dawn, when the lights of a ranger station came into view. Tommy survived, but barely. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. Later, I learned the area was famous for stories of wendigos, creatures born of cannibalism and driven by insatiable hunger. I don't know if that's what we saw, but one thing's for sure, the woods keep their secrets, and not all of them should be found. Thank you for making it to the end of the video, guys. I really appreciate you listening. Please let me know if you would like me to improve something. I really liked this story. The Wendigo ones are usually scarier than the rest, and considering the history of the Wendigos, it makes sense, at least to me. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Wish you all the best, and good night. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good night.